Okay, so let's start out by just knocking a couple more of those terms out of the way. It talks about how when he asks Poole about the mail, he said the only thing that they'd received were circulars, right? We know circulars can refer to like mail circulation, right? Circulars refer to just the advertisements in the mail, right? You still receive these, right? You know how you receive those things, the Steak and Shake coupons, the Culver's coupons, advertisements for our IKEA. Those circulars are still very much, they're very, very much still a part of our daily life. Another thing it talks about in terms of Jekyll's awareness of what had happened to Sir Danvers Carew. Now, we know why he really knows what happened to Sir Danvers Carew, but what he says in terms of how he knew is he says he heard the crying in the square. This term, crying in the square, refers to the time when newspapers were actually being circulated, not just by having them delivered in the mail, although that had started up, but a lot of the circulation was literally by criers, like these people who were paid very low wages, so it was often given to young boys, right? You've seen it in a lot of old movies or in those Bugs Bunny cartoons. Extra, extra, read all about it. And what would happen is these boys would literally be paid to shout at the top of their lungs the sensational headlines, murder of MP, murder of member of parliament, gory blood, right? And they yell it in a way that's as sensational as possible in order to get people to buy the paper. And it says that, they've been doing it so long that you'll notice that Utterson says their voices by now are hoarse, right? And when we say hoarse, right, that's another way of saying that the voice is raspy, right? I've done, quite a few lectures today. I think this is my third or fourth full lecture I'm doing today, so my own voice feels a little hoarse and raspy because I'm trying to knock out quite a few of them. So the idea, right, is that Jekyll can supposedly know this because the term is already all around London. One of the other words that I don't think you probably are going to know, this one unfortunately doesn't really affect the plot very much, but it refers to the lamps, it refers to the mists, which symbolize the confusion, the mystery of the story. It said that the lamps shone like carbuncles, and I doubt anybody is going to know what a carbuncle is. A carbuncle is a fake ruby, but it sometimes is referring to like a magical red imitation ruby that glows, right? So it's, but the idea of it growing like a red thing, right? Just the idea of a red mist is a rather ominous thing, a red glow in the fog of the streets with a recent murderer. And it gives the idea of blood on the air, right? The idea of carbuncles, red glowing jewels, is the idea that not only is it misty, not only is it confusing, right? This is Utterson, but Utterson is trying to think his way through the blood, right? He's trying to deal with this murder mystery, which is symbolized by glowing red orbs in the middle of the mist, okay? So all of these are kind of some of the terms that you might not be familiar with. Now, there's also the term forger, right? Which means someone who fakes another's handwriting, or to forge, right? When you get a bad grade, or, you need your parent to sign a slip and you really don't want to show it to them and you might try to pretend it's their signature. That's called forging, right? Sometimes, students will forge permission slips because they forget to give it to their parents. Don't do that, okay? Right? That's another thing. Another thing, a term that you might not be familiar with, and here's the weird thing, is when I read this, because I hadn't read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for a while, it read that Utterson, had a ticklish decision to make. And it was funny because normally when I see these phrases in literature, being that I have an advanced degree in literature, I normally am not so stumped by this. I'm like, what is a ticklish decision? So I did a Google search, I did a search on Google Scholar, and I really couldn't find an adequate definition for this phrase, ticklish decision. So what I'm about to give you is what I think the author means when he says ticklish decision, is referring to, I just think, just common sense, a common sense definition of what this might mean. So if you think about being ticklish, like you're kind of whatever, you're a little jumpy. I think the idea of a ticklish decision is that it's a decision which is kind of making his skin crawl, making him a bit uncomfortable. I'm not going to put that on a quiz though, because I'm not entirely sure that that's what it means, but I think that's just the best common sense interpretation. One of the interesting things about coming across some of these old phrases is sometimes I can't even look up what this means because I couldn't find any other examples of ticklish decision in literature. So this is when we kind of have to use our critical thinking and our common sense to try to discern what this phrase means. So let's move on in terms of the story, right? One of the things, a term that you might have heard of, might not have heard of, is the fact is that Utterson, for some reason, he's suspicious of this letter that Dr. Jekyll claims was given to him by Mr. Hyde. He says he burned the envelope. Why would you burn the envelope? And so he takes it to this character by the name of Mr. Guest, right, who's a clerk. And Mr. Guest does a study, and he notices that the handwriting of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is eerily similar. So similar that Utterson suspects that Jekyll has actually forged a letter by Mr. Hyde. And this refers to this idea of the study of what's called graphology. Graphology is the study of handwriting. It's the study of handwriting and supposedly the study of the psychology of handwriting. Now, there are different kinds of graphology. There are certain kinds of graphology, which is, can you determine if this person in fact wrote this document? That part of graphology is in fact a real science. There's another definition of graphology that has kind of become a little bit like phrenology, right? It's one of those pseudosciences that have been discredited. There are some people who believe that you can also use handwriting in order to study the psyche of the person who is doing the handwriting. The problem with that, and some people might think there's something to it, and even if there is something to it, there's certainly not enough to it to be able to make it a studying science. For example, a lot of times when I'm writing, right, especially when I'm writing in the morning, I have asthma, so I often take my asthma medication in the morning. And when I take my asthma medication, which is a very strong stimulant, I have a trembling hand. And that trembling hand greatly affects my writing. So how are you going to be able to tell anything about me psychologically by my trembling handwriting? Like, oh, this person is clearly suffering from anxiety. You can see how they tremble when they write. But okay, you might be able to tell that someone trembles when they write by analyzing their writing, but being able to determine the psychological reason for that trembling is going to assume connections which can't come in evidence, because that trembling could be attributed to a number of things. It could be attributed to maybe someone has a shaking sickness. Maybe they really are anxious. Maybe they're like me and they have trembling hands certain parts of the day because of the side effects of their medication. So graphology is still a real science when it comes to, can we analyze handwriting to try to figure out whose handwriting is whose, and is this person a forger, or did this person write the same two documents? That is a legitimate science. But the idea of graphology is determining the psyche of the person writing it, that has been largely discredited. The thing is, though, when he gives this thing that's supposedly from Mr. Hyde, right, Mr. Guest automatically assumed, because Mr. Hyde kept beating Sir Danvers' crew even after he was insensate, right? After he was unconscious, still beating him and breaking his bones and mangling his body even after, right, he had no sense left, right? He was assumed that he was mad, right? But according to the handwriting, Mr. Guest says, using his graphological knowledge, is that no, he's not mad, but he is odd, right? But he says the only difference between Jekyll and Hyde's handwriting, and this is an important thing in terms of the story, not that this is true in terms of any real scientific sense, right? But the idea is that he says they're sloped differently, right? That the writing is basically the same on many points, but they're sloped differently. And one of the core beliefs of graphology is that people, especially in early graphology, and again, a lot of this is discredited, so don't buy into it, but a lot of it was, if your handwriting slopes up, then you're more intellectual, right? Or maybe this indicates that you're more spiritual or heavenly, right? The idea is they believed that a upward slope revealed a good character, and a downward slope was a bad character, more carnal, more earthy, more sensual, less intellectual. Now, again, considering a lot of the way we write has absolutely nothing to do with how we think, and I mean, I'm sure there are certain things you might be able to tell by personality of your handwriting. A lot of this has been discredited. The key idea, right, about the discussion of the sloping has a lot to do with this idea of going back to references to Darwin. The idea that evil represents a more primitive man and goodness resembles a more evolved man. It's literally, right, the slope, right, would be the akin to, the upright position rather than the caveman who is kind of barely has his knuckles off the ground, right? The idea of the upward slope is to indicate that the civilized man is more evolved, right? And so the idea of Henry Jekyll being a forger, or the fact that they have the same handwriting, I mean, you probably have figured out why they have pretty close to the same handwriting at this point, but their handwriting is still definitively different. They do seem to be oriented in different directions. The whole idea of this is the idea, again, coming back to this idea of degeneracy, and the idea of human beings, just as they can evolve, they reach the upright position, can they also devolve? Can they become more ape-like, the way Mr. Hyde is more ape-like? Can they become more carnal? Can they become more primitive? Can they become more evil, more selfish, less cooperative, less evolved? That is this idea. And again, degeneracy, right, this idea of degeneracy, it's linked with these Darwinian ideas, right? Because, of course, you'll notice that Soho is full of foreigners. And so because they're not good British white people, the thought is that maybe they are still human, but maybe not as human or not as evolved as, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So there's just a little bit of cultural racism in here, at least racism depicted in the book. I don't know about Robert Louis Stevenson himself. And the idea, though, that degeneracy still, once again, seemingly associated with vice and may be provoked by drink, right? Again, the lieu of vice or drink being a possible trigger or cause of a lot of this is a theme that seems to be still apparent within the novel. Even in the discussion of this part, where you notice that Utterson is thinking in his study, it talks about an old wine that has gotten refined with age and how light and how time has changed the acidity of the wine, right? Once again, we see this reference to light and drink, right? This, how the light has changed the drink and changed the acidity of the drink. Having an old fine wine, which he has saved for years, meaning he's had the control not to go for it or not to drink it until now. The idea is, it's the idea of the control of impulse, right? And the idea of mastery over sensuality, right? So even though it's not so simple as to just say that the thing that changes Jekyll into Hyde is alcohol, once again, we see an example of old fine wine being mentioned. For what reason? To show that Utterson has had the patience to keep it this long, or it's been, the difference between someone who apparently can drink but is not a drunkard, right? Why? And again, once again, this being compared with Hyde, who had so many things of wine and apparently had drank so many, right? There are these hints, and again, it shouldn't be assuming that we're not saying that Robert Louis Stevenson is saying drinking is what changes people into monsters, but there's definitely this clear allusion to the idea of how drinking and degeneracy and becoming more primitive, all of these things are kind of being thrown together in the milieu of Victorian culture. It's kind of all going together, right? So that ends this, and I guess I was able to get through it in 2 recordings. So anyway, that is the incident of the letter. I hope you guys are still enjoying these lectures. Please remember, honor students, that you have your Zoom session. First hour, please come at 1. 6th hour, please come at 1:30. That way we're not all crowded in 1 hour. If you do feel like you need some more time, or you need, again, feel free to try to get me on the office hours if you want to ask me questions, or ask me questions on the Prof TUI, either the instant messenger or email, because I see those faster than I see my Thomas More emails. Almost said Assumption email. It was my last Catholic high school. But anyway, Jesus loves you and so do I. Please remember that quiz on Google Classroom is coming up, and I can't wait to actually see you all in person. Bye for now.